welcome to the show and happy holidays to you.
Thank you very much.
So tell us about your expertise and your passion and why this is such an important part of history to delve into.
So what I'm interested in, particularly with reference to this period, is kind of representations of Jesus. And we have an interesting transformation going on if we look at the history of Christianity over the last 2,000 years. Whereas, like, from more or less the Reformation on, the main disputes within Christianity have to do with issues of authority, and now we have issues of, let's say, sexual ethics, if we think of differences between churches in the United States, for example. In antiquity, the main question that was on everybody's mind was, who was Jesus? And it begins already in the Gospels, in the earliest sources. We have the four Gospels, where we have this interesting exchange where Jesus says to the apostles, who do people say that I am? And they give different answers. Is it John the Baptist? Is it a prophet? Is it Elijah? One of the main versions is that he was the Messiah, according to his believers. Another version is he was the Son of God. Other people say he was a simple person. And that kind of question remains in scholarship on the historical Jesus. There are different opinions who this Jesus was, how do we portray him? But also in the ancient church, beyond the question in the Gospels, there were big theological debates about who Jesus was, what his nature was. Once he becomes more and more divine, and we have traces of this already going back to the earliest Christian sources and Paul in the first century. Once he is conceived of as divine and as part of the Trinity, then a question that occupies many theologians is figuring out what's the relationship between his human and his divine nature. This is a big theological question that tears the church apart, and to a large degree, those differences are with us to this day in terms of the different ecclesiastical denominations within Christianity.
And you
today.
can see even just in the depiction of him in art over all of the millennia, but you know, where did that come from? Because it seems also there was really no description anywhere of what he looked like. We could assume he was Semitic looking because he was a Jew. Exactly,
and that's a very interesting question. If we go back to the earliest sources, of course, in the New Testament, there's no description of what Jesus looked like. And the early church fathers kind of picked up on that and said, wait, what did he look like? And there were two answers to this question, two very interesting answers that are quite different from the kind of standard depiction that developed later. The first answer was that he was polymorphous. What does polymorphous mean? It means that he could appear in many different forms and many different likenesses. They speak about young and old, and ugly and beautiful, and large and small, and even in some sources, male and female, interestingly enough. So that's one depiction that we see in the 3rd century, let's say, when people start asking themselves, what did he look like? Another depiction is based on an interpretation of a prophecy in the book of Isaiah, which becomes a kind of key source in the history of Christianity. This is Isaiah chapter 53. Which is a description of a messianic figure that becomes very popular in Christian sources. And in that chapter, at the beginning of that chapter, the messianic figure is depicted as having neither beauty nor majesty. And some of the early church fathers actually say this means that Jesus must have been ugly. What ugly means and how they imagined ugly, I'm not quite sure.
Exactly, it's all relative to the time. Relative. Rubens, look at Rubens.
Exactly.
The painter.
So, but it was important for them to actually imagine him in unattractive terms. It's only later that we begin to see the kind of traditional depiction of Jesus with the longer hair and the shortish beard and the thin face that becomes kind of the standard look for Jesus, both in the East and in the West. But there's much discussion about that, actually. And I think since we're here on this spot, right outside the church here, there's an interesting pillar on the entrance, right in the gate outside, that is associated with what happens at Gethsemane, where Jesus is betrayed and handed over to the authorities. And one of the early church fathers, Epiphanius, Bishop of Salamis in Cyprus, was very against depicting Jesus materially, figuratively. And he, in one of his writings, in a letter that he writes to the emperor, says that, you know, there's this image of Jesus having long hair. Well, he couldn't have had long hair because well, I'll take a step back. They say he had long hair because they misread the word Nazarene. Rather than Nazarene, as somebody from Nazareth, people read it as a Nazarite, somebody who exactly has the long hair because he doesn't cut it, because like Samson, exactly. And Epiphanius offers two arguments against that look, which he was against depicting him in general, but he says even if we go with that look, it can't be right. The first argument, says Epiphanius, and Epiphanius, by the way, is considered a saint in all the churches. He's not some obscure heretical figure. Epiphanius offers the following two arguments. He says, first of all, we see that he drank wine. In the depictions in the Gospels, he drank wine, so he can't be a Nazarite. And second of all, getting back to that pillar and getting back to the Gethsemane scene, he says Judas had to come and identify him, give him a kiss to identify him to the authorities. He says if he had long hair and all his apostles had short hair, then why the need to identify him? It would have been obvious. So that's a very interesting argument offered in one of the early sources. But over time, that does become the common depiction. And it, as I said before, this question of the representation of Jesus and who Jesus was and whether we can represent him at all, whether Christians can represent him at all, is something that really flares up in late antiquity in a big controversy, especially in Byzantium, around iconoclasm, around this question of whether one can even make icons of Jesus.
Dr. Moss, thank you so much for your valuable insight on this everlasting, interesting topic.
You're very welcome.